The grocery store clerk rolled her eyes as the woman in faded jeans fumbled with her discount coupons. Behind her, teenagers snickered at her worn sneakers and outdated jacket. The cashier's nameplate read Jessica, and her impatience was obvious as she tapped her manicured nails on the counter. "Ma'am, this coupon expired last week," Jessica said loudly, making sure everyone in line could hear. The woman quietly nodded and put the coupon away, paying full price for her modest groceries. As she walked toward the exit, one of the teenagers called out, "Hey lady, maybe try shopping somewhere you can actually afford." Laughter erupted from the group. The woman paused for just a moment, her hand tightening on her grocery bag, then continued walking without looking back. What none of them knew was that in exactly 72 hours, this same woman would be standing before the President of the United States, receiving the highest military honor their country could bestow. What they couldn't see beneath her civilian clothes were scars from missions that would never be declassified, and what they couldn't hear in her quiet voice was the authority that had once commanded nuclear submarines in the world's most dangerous waters. Admiral Sarah Mitchell had spent 30 years protecting people who would never know her name. Now, retired and trying to live a normal life, she was discovering that the hardest battle wasn't against enemy forces. It was against a society that judged her by her appearance instead of her character. But sometimes, the truth has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it. Sarah Mitchell pushed her shopping cart through the automatic doors of Harborview Market, the same grocery store she had visited every Tuesday for the past 6 months since moving to the small coastal town of Millfield. The Pacific breeze carried the scent of salt water through the parking lot, reminding her of mornings aboard nuclear submarines when the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. At 52, Sarah looked like any other middle-aged woman running errands. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same faded jeans and navy blue windbreaker she had owned for years. The only hint of her extraordinary past was the way she carried herself, straight-backed and alert. But most people were too busy with their own lives to notice such details. She had chosen Millfield specifically because it was unremarkable. After 3 decades of military service, with the last 15 years spent in positions so classified that even her family didn't know what she really did for a living, Sarah craved normalcy. She wanted to buy groceries without security clearances, walk on beaches without scanning for threats, and maybe, just maybe, figure out who she was when she wasn't Admiral Mitchell of the United States Navy SEALs. The retirement ceremony had been small and private, attended only by a handful of officials who understood the weight of her service. No media coverage, no public recognition. That was how it had to be when your career involved operations that could never see daylight. The president himself had thanked her personally, calling her one of our nation's most valuable assets, but to the outside world, Sarah Mitchell simply didn't exist in any meaningful way. Now, as she selected apples and checked prices on cereal boxes, she tried to embrace this invisibility. It should have been liberating. Instead, it felt strangely hollow. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a woman in her 30s. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer workout clothes, and an expression of barely contained irritation. Her name tag read, "Manager, Brenda Walsh."
"Yes,"
Sarah replied politely. "I've had several complaints about you," Brenda said, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "Apparently you've been holding up the express lane, using expired coupons, and generally causing problems for my staff." Sarah felt a familiar calmness settle over her, the same composure that had served her during crisis situations thousands of feet underwater. "I apologize if there's been any confusion, but I don't believe I've caused any problems." "Look," Brenda continued, her voice growing more aggressive, "I don't know what your situation is, but this is a respectable establishment. If you can't afford to shop here without making a scene over every discount coupon, maybe you should try the food bank down on Elm Street." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Sarah noticed several people holding up their phones, no doubt recording what they assumed would be an entertaining confrontation. She also noticed something else, the way some of the employees were looking at her with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if her modest appearance automatically made her a problem customer. "I understand your concern," Sarah said calmly, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," interrupted a teenage employee named Derek, emboldened by his manager's behavior, "is you thinking you belong in a nice place like this? Maybe stick to the dollar store next time." Several people laughed. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the sting of genuine humiliation. During her military career, she had been shot at, nearly drowned, and faced down international terrorists, But none of that had prepared her for the casual cruelty of ordinary civilians who judged her worth by her appearance. An elderly man in an expensive suit nodded approvingly. Young man's got a point. Standards matter in a community. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, some amused, some uncomfortable, but none willing to speak up on her behalf. For a moment, she considered revealing who she was. A few words about her military service would probably shut down this humiliation immediately. But something held her back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the realization that if she had to use her past achievements to earn basic human respect, then she would be teaching these people nothing at all. Instead, she simply nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," she said quietly, then turned and walked toward the exit, leaving her half-filled cart behind. As she reached her car, she could hear laughter and conversation resuming inside the store. Someone was probably already posting the video online with a caption about entitled customers getting put in their place. Sarah sat in her modest Honda Civic, a far cry from the military vehicles she was accustomed to, and allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of what had just happened. For 30 years, she had been Admiral Sarah Mitchell, one of the most decorated officers in naval history. She had commanded SEAL teams in operations that prevented terrorist attacks, rescued hostages from hostile territories, and gathered intelligence that kept millions of Americans safe while they slept. She had been trusted with nuclear codes, consulted by presidents, and respected by world leaders. Now, she was just a middle-aged woman in a grocery store parking lot, reduced to tears by a manager who probably made minimum wage. But as Sarah drove home to her small rental house overlooking the harbor, something began to crystallize in her mind. The people in that store had revealed something ugly about themselves today. Their willingness to participate in public humiliation. Their assumption that someone's appearance determined their worth. Their complete lack of basic human compassion. She had spent her career protecting people like them, but now she was beginning to wonder if they deserved that protection. Sarah's house was spartanly furnished, much like her quarters had been during her military service. The only decorations were a few framed photographs, her graduating class from the Naval Academy, her first SEAL team, and a picture of her receiving a classified commendation from a former Secretary of Defense. She had hidden these photos in a bedroom drawer when she moved to Millfield, wanting to completely separate her past from her present. Now, she pulled them out and looked at them for the first time in months. The woman in those photographs stood with perfect military bearing, surrounded by some of the most elite warriors in the world. Her uniform was covered with ribbons and decorations that told the story of a life dedicated to service and sacrifice. Her eyes held the confidence of someone who had never backed down from a challenge, never let fear dictate her actions, never allowed anyone to make her feel small. Sarah wondered what had happened to that woman. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she recognized, her former second-in-command, Commander Jake Torres, who had served under her for 8 years during some of their most dangerous operations. "Admiral." Jake's voice was warm with familiarity. "How's retirement treating you?"
"It's an adjustment," Sarah replied carefully.
"I bet. Listen, I'm calling because something interesting came up. You remember that hostage situation in Somalia back in 2019? The one where you led the rescue mission that saved those aid workers?" Of course. How could she forget? 12 hours underwater, followed by a precision strike on a heavily fortified compound with 0 casualties among the hostages. Well, one of those aid workers, Dr. Emily Chen, she's been trying to track you down. Apparently she's giving a speech at some big humanitarian conference, and she wants to thank you publicly. She says your team saved not just her life, but the lives of hundreds of children in the refugee camp she was treating. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Dr. Chen had been barely conscious when they extracted her from that compound, beaten and dehydrated after 2 weeks in captivity. Sarah remembered carrying the smaller woman to the extraction helicopter, promising her that she was safe now. "I appreciate the thought, Jake, but you know I can't do public appearances." "Actually, Admiral, that's changed. The classification on the Somalia operation was lifted last week. You're free to discuss it publicly if you choose to." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. "Lifted?" "Completely. The Defense Department decided that enough time had passed and the political situation had stabilized enough that there was no longer any security risk. In fact, they're encouraging some recognition of that mission. It was textbook perfect, and it showed American military capabilities at their finest." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her kitchen as the sun set over the Pacific. For the first time since her retirement, she felt something stirring that she had thought was gone forever. Purpose. The people in that grocery store had judged her as worthless, someone who didn't belong in their community. They had participated in her humiliation with the casual cruelty of those who had never faced real hardship or danger. They had no idea that while they slept safely in their beds, people like Sarah had spent decades ensuring that safety. But maybe it was time they learned. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing an email to Dr. Chen. As she wrote, she found herself thinking not just about Somalia, but about all the operations that had never been acknowledged, all the lives saved by missions that would never be celebrated, all the sacrifices made by people whose names would never be known. Tomorrow was Wednesday. The weekly Millfield Town Council meeting was open to the public, and according to the local newspaper she had been reading, they were discussing community values and the kind of residents they wanted to attract to their growing town. Sarah thought she might just attend that meeting. As she finished her email to Dr. Chen, she walked to her bedroom drawer and pulled out her dress blue uniform. It had been 6 months since she had worn it, but it still fit perfectly. The ribbons and decorations caught the lamplight, each one representing a moment when she had chosen duty over personal comfort, service over self-interest, courage over fear. For 30 years, Sarah Mitchell had been a guardian that nobody knew existed. Tomorrow, she would begin to change that. The Millfield Community Centre buzzed with the usual Wednesday evening crowd as residents filed in for the monthly town council meeting. Sarah arrived early, wearing a simple black blazer and slacks, her hair neatly styled. She chose a seat in the back row, observing the familiar faces from around town, many of whom had witnessed or participated in her humiliation at the grocery store just 2 days earlier. Brenda Walsh, the store manager who had publicly berated her, sat in the third row, chatting animatedly with other local business owners. Derek, the teenage employee who had suggested she shop at the dollar store, was there with his parents, probably required to attend for some school civic engagement project. The elderly man in the expensive suit who had agreed that standards matter was actually seated on the council itself, his nameplate reading, Councilman Robert Hayes. Mayor Patricia Lawson called the meeting to order with her usual flourish. A former real estate agent who had campaigned on keeping Millfield upscale and family-friendly, she had the practiced smile of someone who was always performing for an audience. Before we begin our regular agenda, Mayor Lawson announced, I want to address something that's been brought to my attention. There have been concerns about certain individuals in our community who may not reflect the values and standards we've worked so hard to establish here in Millfield. Sarah felt a familiar alertness, the same heightened awareness that had kept her alive during countless military operations. Something was happening here, and she suspected she was at the center of it. Councilman Hayes cleared his throat and stood up. If I may, Patricia, I think we need to be direct about this issue. We've all worked hard to build Millfield into a desirable place to live and raise families. Property values are up, crime is down, and we've attracted quality businesses and residents. But lately, there have been incidents that threaten the reputation we've built. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah noticed several people glancing in her direction, though they probably didn't realize she was the subject of their discussion. Just yesterday, Councilman Hayes continued, I witnessed a disturbing scene at Harbourview Market. A woman, clearly not from our usual demographic, was causing problems for the staff, using expired coupons, and generally disrupting the shopping experience for legitimate customers. When the manager very politely addressed the situation, this individual became difficult and had to be asked to leave. Sarah almost smiled at the creative retelling of events. In Hayes' version, Brenda had been polite, Sarah had been difficult, and the public humiliation had been justified management of a problem customer. Brenda Walsh stood up, clearly having planned this moment. As the manager involved in that incident, I can confirm that we're seeing more and more of these situations. People who clearly can't afford to shop at our establishment, causing scenes over discount coupons, making our regular customers uncomfortable. It's hurting our business and our community's reputation. What exactly are you proposing? Asked Councilwoman Maria Santos, one of the younger members who had been quiet until now. Mayor Lawson smiled her campaign smile. We're considering an ordinance that would give local businesses more authority to maintain their standards. Essentially, it would support business owners in excluding individuals who don't meet basic community standards of conduct and appearance. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. They were literally discussing ways to exclude people based on appearance and economic status. The irony was almost overwhelming. She probably had more money in her retirement accounts than half the people in this room combined. But because she chose to dress modestly and use coupons, she was being classified as undesirable. A man in his 40s raised his hand. Sarah recognized him as Tom Bradley, who owned a local restaurant. I support this completely. Last week, I had someone come into my place wearing old clothes and asking about our cheapest menu items. It made my other customers uncomfortable.
These people need to understand that not every establishment is meant for them.
Exactly. Agreed, a woman Sarah didn't recognize.
We moved here to get away from those kinds of elements. If we wanted to deal with lowlifes and troublemakers, we would have stayed in the city. Sarah listened as speaker after speaker rose to support what they were calling the Community Standards Initiative. They spoke about property values, business reputations, and maintaining the character of their town. What they were really talking about, Sarah realized, was creating an official system to exclude anyone who didn't meet their narrow definition of respectability. The few voices of dissent were quickly shouted down. Councilwoman Santos tried to point out the legal and ethical problems with such an ordinance, but she was outnumbered and eventually fell silent. As the discussion wound down, Mayor Lawson called for public comments. This is your opportunity to speak up about this important issue affecting our community's future. Sarah stood up. The room fell silent as heads turned to look at the woman in the back row. She walked slowly to the front, her military bearing evident to anyone who knew what to look for, though this crowd clearly didn't. State your name for the record, Mayor Lawson said with barely concealed disdain. Sarah Mitchell. I'm a resident of Millfield, living at 1247 Harbour View Drive. And do you have something to say about our Community Standards Initiative? Councilman Hayes asked, his tone suggesting he expected her to apologize for her existence. Sarah looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. She saw Brenda Walsh whispering to her neighbour, probably pointing out that this was the troublesome customer from the grocery store. She saw Derek's parents shifting uncomfortably, perhaps beginning to suspect their son had been involved in something ugly.
I do have something to say, Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded rooms full of military officers and government officials.
I want to talk about community standards and what they really mean. She paused, letting the silence stretch.
This was a technique she had learned during interrogations. Silence made people uncomfortable and more likely to reveal their true thoughts. 2 days ago, I was shopping at Harbourview Market when I was publicly humiliated by staff and customers who decided, based solely on my appearance, that I didn't belong in their store. I was told I should shop at the food bank instead. I was mocked by teenagers while adults watched and laughed. I was treated as less than human because I was dressed modestly and using discount coupons. Uncomfortable shuffling filled the room. Several people were now staring at their hands or phones, unwilling to make eye contact. Now I'm here listening to you discuss ways to make that kind of discrimination official town policy. You want to give businesses the right to exclude people who don't meet your standards of appearance and conduct. You're talking about keeping out what you call undesirable elements and lowlifes. Mayor Lawson tried to interrupt. Now see here, we're not talking about... Let me finish, Sarah said, and something in her tone made the mayor fall silent immediately. You've spent this entire meeting talking about the kind of community you want to build, about attracting quality residents, about maintaining standards, but you haven't once mentioned the standards that actually matter. She turned to face the crowd directly. You haven't talked about integrity, or kindness, or treating your neighbors with basic human dignity. You haven't mentioned standing up for those who can't defend themselves, or judging people by their character instead of their clothes. You haven't discussed what it means to be truly worthy of the freedoms and security you take for granted every day. The room was completely silent now. Even the usual shuffling and whispering had stopped. You want to know about standards? Sarah continued. Let me tell you about real standards. Real standards mean doing the right thing when no one is watching. Real standards mean protecting those who are vulnerable, not excluding them. Real standards mean recognizing that a person's worth has nothing to do with their bank account or their wardrobe. Councilman Hayes found his voice. This is all very philosophical, Ms. Mitchell, but the reality is that businesses have the right to maintain their standards, and communities have the right to attract the kind of residents they want. You're absolutely right about one thing, Mr. Hayes, Sarah replied. Communities do get the kind of residents they deserve, and based on what I've seen here tonight, Millfield is getting exactly what it deserves. She began walking back toward her seat, then stopped and turned around one final time. There's something else you should know about standards. Real standards aren't about excluding people who don't meet your arbitrary requirements. Real standards are about rising to meet the challenges that matter, about serving something greater than yourself, about earning the respect you demand from others.
Sarah sat down, leaving the room in stunned silence.
After a long moment, Mayor Lawson cleared her throat and attempted to regain control of the meeting. Well, that was... interesting. Now, let's move on to the vote on the Community Standards Initiative. But something had shifted in the room. The confident momentum that had carried the discussion earlier was gone. Several council members were looking uncomfortable, and the crowd seemed less certain about their position. When the vote came, it passed by a narrow margin. 4 votes in favour, 3 opposed. But the victory felt hollow. Councilwoman Santos had been joined in opposition by 2 members who had seemed supportive earlier, and several residents left the meeting without staying for the final tally. As people filed out of the community centre, Sarah noticed the conversations had a different tone. Instead of the self-righteous certainty that had marked the beginning of the meeting, people spoke in hushed, uncertain voices. Some avoided looking at her altogether, while others watched her with what might have been curiosity or even respect. Outside in the parking lot, Councilwoman Santos approached her.
Miss
Mitchell, I want you to know that I thought your comments tonight were exactly what this community needed to hear. I'm embarrassed by what passed in there. Thank you, Sarah replied.
But I'm not done yet.
What do you mean?
Sarah looked back at the community centre, where Mayor Lawson was still glad-handing supporters and probably already planning how to implement their new discriminatory policies.
I mean that this community is about to learn some important lessons about standards.
Real standards. As she drove home that night, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her retirement. A sense of mission. Tomorrow, she would make some phone calls. Chen's humanitarian conference was just the beginning. It was time for Millfield to discover exactly who they had been so eager to exclude from their perfect little community. The woman they had mocked and marginalized was about to remind them that respect isn't something you can legislate or buy. It's something you earn. And after 30 years of earning it in the most dangerous places on earth, Sarah Mitchell was ready to collect what she was owed. Sarah stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the ribbons on her dress blue naval uniform for the first time in 6 months. Each decoration told a story that the people of Millfield could never imagine. The Silver Star for valor during the rescue operation in Somalia, the Navy Cross for a classified mission that prevented a terrorist attack on American soil, the Purple Heart for wounds received during an underwater demolition operation that saved an entire aircraft carrier group. Today was Friday, exactly 1 week after the town council meeting, and Dr. Emily Chen's humanitarian conference was being broadcast live from San Francisco. Sarah had accepted the invitation to speak via video link, and she had specifically requested that the feed be made available to local news stations. What the residents of Millfield didn't know was that Sarah had spent the past week making other arrangements as well. At exactly 2 p.m., as scheduled, Sarah's laptop screen filled with the image of Dr. Chen standing at a podium before an audience of international humanitarian workers, government officials, and medical professionals. Sarah's own image appeared on a large screen behind the podium, showing her in full military dress uniform. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chen began, her voice carrying the emotion of someone who had faced death and lived to tell about it. I want to introduce someone who embodies everything we're discussing today about courage, sacrifice, and protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In 2019, I was kidnapped while providing medical aid to refugees in Somalia. For 2 weeks, I was held by terrorists who threatened to execute me and my colleagues.
Sarah watched through her laptop as the audience grew silent, completely focused on Dr.
Chen's words. What happened next sounds like something from a movie, but I assure you it was terrifyingly real. A team of Navy SEALs, led by Admiral Sarah Mitchell, conducted a precision rescue operation that saved not just my life, but the lives of my entire medical team. They did this knowing that failure meant death for all of us, and probable capture and torture for themselves. Dr. Chen turned to face Sarah's image on the screen. Admiral Mitchell personally carried me to the evacuation helicopter when I was too weak to walk.
She stayed with me during the flight to safety, and the last thing I remember before losing consciousness was her telling me that I was safe now, that Americans don't abandon Americans.
The camera focused on Sarah, and she began to speak with the same quiet authority she had once used to brief presidents and world leaders.
Dr. Chen, it was an honor to serve in that operation. But I want everyone watching to understand something important. That mission succeeded because we had a team of extraordinary individuals who were willing to risk everything for people they had never met in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. That's what service means, putting others before yourself, especially when those others can't defend themselves. Meanwhile, across Millfield, people were beginning to gather around television screens and computer monitors. The local news station had picked up the live feed, and word was spreading quickly through social media that the woman from the town council meeting was apparently some kind of military officer. At Harborview Market, Brenda Walsh stood frozen behind the customer service counter, staring at the television mounted on the wall. The woman she had publicly humiliated, the woman she had told to shop at the food bank, was wearing more military decorations than Brenda had ever seen in her life. "That can't be her," whispered Derek, who was working his afternoon shift.
That lady from the other day, that was just some homeless person or something. But it was unmistakably Sarah Mitchell on the screen, and she was continuing her remarks to the international audience.
"The reason I'm sharing this story today isn't to seek recognition for myself or my team. We were doing our jobs. Jobs we chose because we believed in something larger than our own comfort or convenience. I'm sharing this because Dr. Apologize. Chen's work, providing medical care to refugee children who had no other hope, represents the same principle. Service to others, especially those society has forgotten or written off." Sarah paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a subtle edge that anyone who knew her well would recognize as a warning. "Recently, I've been reminded that not everyone shares these values. I've encountered people who believe that a person's worth can be measured by their appearance, their economic status, or how well they fit into arbitrary social standards. I've seen communities that claim to value character and integrity while simultaneously working to exclude anyone they deem unworthy of their company." At the Millfield Community Center, Mayor Patricia Lawson was frantically trying to reach her campaign manager. She had just received 3 phone calls from reporters asking about the town's recent Community Standards Initiative and whether she had any comment on Admiral Mitchell's remarks. Councilman Hayes, watching from his law office, felt his stomach dropping as he realized the implications of what was unfolding. The woman he had dismissed as a troublemaker was not only a decorated military officer, but was currently addressing an international audience that included government officials and media representatives. "This brings me to my main point today," Sarah continued from her living room in Millfield. "True humanitarian work, true service to community, means recognizing the dignity and worth of every person, regardless of how they look or what they can afford to spend in your store. It means understanding that the person you dismiss as worthless might be someone who has spent their life protecting your freedom to dismiss them." Dr. Lord, Chen nodded enthusiastically. "Admiral Mitchell, your point about dignity is crucial to everything we do in humanitarian work. Can you tell our audience more about how your military service shaped your understanding of these values?" Sarah smiled, and there was something in that smile that would have been familiar to enemy combatants who had faced her across interrogation tables. "Certainly, Dr. Chen. During my 30-year career with the Navy SEALs, I learned that real strength isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to protect those who need protection. Real courage isn't about facing down armed enemies, though I've done that. Real courage is about standing up for what's right when it's inconvenient, unpopular, or costly to yourself." She leaned forward slightly, looking directly into the camera. "I learned these lessons in places most people will never see, facing challenges most people will never have to face. But the principles apply everywhere, including in small American towns where the greatest threat isn't enemy soldiers or terrorists. It's the casual cruelty of ordinary people who have forgotten what it means to be worthy of the freedoms they enjoy."
Across Millfield, phones were beginning to ring.
Local reporters had figured out that Admiral Mitchell was a resident of their town, and they wanted to know about the Community Standards Initiative she had mentioned. Social media posts were spreading rapidly, with people sharing video clips of Sarah's remarks and asking whether this was the same woman who had been mistreated at Harborview Market. At the grocery store, customers were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Several had recognized Sarah from the video and were demanding to know why the store's management had treated a decorated military officer so poorly. Brenda Walsh found herself trying to explain a situation that had no good explanation. "I didn't know," she kept repeating. "How was I supposed to know she was in the military?" But that response only made things worse, because it revealed the underlying problem. Brenda had thought it was acceptable to humiliate someone as long as that person wasn't important enough to fight back. Back at the conference, Dr. Chen was wrapping up the interview segment. "Admiral Mitchell, before we close, is there anything else you'd like to share with our international audience about service and community values?" Sarah nodded. "Just this. The same qualities that make someone willing to serve their country, integrity, courage, selflessness, are the qualities that make communities strong. When we abandon those principles, when we start judging people by superficial standards instead of character, we weaken the very foundations of the society we claim to be protecting." She paused one final time, and her next words were clearly directed at a very specific audience. "To the residents of Millfield, California, who may be watching this, You recently voted to support an ordinance that would allow businesses to exclude people based on appearance and economic status. You did this because you wanted to maintain your community standards. I want you to think carefully about what standards you're actually maintaining, and whether they're worthy of the sacrifice made by people like Dr. Chen's medical team, or the Navy SEALs who rescued them, or the countless other Americans who serve in places you'll never see so that you can live in comfort and security. The interview concluded, but Sarah's phone was already ringing. The first call was from a producer at CNN who had seen the conference feed and wanted to do a follow-up story. The second was from a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle who had received a tip about the Millfield Town Council meeting. The third was from Commander Jake Torres, who was laughing so hard he could barely speak.
"Admiral," Jake finally managed, "please tell me you planned all of this."
Not exactly, Sarah replied, watching through her window as news vans began arriving on Harborview Drive.
But when opportunity presents itself, a good officer adapts to take advantage.
Decorated Navy SEAL Admiral speaks out against discrimination was trending on social media. The video of Sarah's remarks at the town council meeting, recorded by someone on their phone, was being shared thousands of times with captions like, "She tried to warn them," and "This is what a real hero looks like." Mayor Lawson held an emergency press conference at 6 p.m., announcing that the Community Standards Initiative was being rescinded pending further review. She carefully avoided taking any questions about Sarah specifically, but her political career was clearly in jeopardy. Harborview Market issued a public apology and announced that Brenda Walsh was no longer employed there. Derek's parents made him write a personal apology letter, which Sarah received along with dozens of others from residents who claimed they had opposed the discriminatory ordinance all along. But the letter that meant the most came from Councilwoman Maria Santos. "Dear Admiral Mitchell, thank you for showing us what real community standards look like. I hope you'll consider running for mayor next year. This town needs leaders who understand the difference between exclusion and excellence." On Saturday morning, Sarah decided to go grocery shopping. When she walked into Harborview Market, wearing the same faded jeans and windbreaker she had worn a week earlier, something remarkable happened. The new manager, a young man who had clearly been briefed on recent events, personally welcomed her and offered to help with her shopping. Other customers nodded respectfully or approached to thank her for her service. An elderly woman she had never met stopped her in the cereal aisle. "Admiral Mitchell, I want to apologize. I wasn't at that council meeting, but I heard about what happened to you here. It's shameful, and it doesn't represent the Millfield I moved here to be part of." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "But you don't need to apologize for other people's actions. You just need to make sure your own actions reflect your values." As Sarah checked out, using several manufacturer coupons without any comment from the cashier, she reflected on the events of the past week. She hadn't set out to become a public figure again or to teach her community a lesson about respect and dignity. But sometimes the most important battles are the ones you don't choose. The teenager bagging her groceries, a different young man than Derek, looked up nervously. "Ma'am, I just want to say thank you for your service. My older brother is in the Marines, and he says the SEALs are the bravest people in the world." Sarah smiled at him, remembering herself at that age, already dreaming of serving her country. "Your brother is brave too. All service members are. But you know what takes real courage? Standing up for what's right in your daily life. Treating everyone with dignity. Being the kind of person others can count on. You don't need to wear a uniform to serve your community." As she drove home, Sarah noticed that several neighbors were working in their yards and waved as she passed. The hostile stares and whispered conversations had been replaced by acknowledgement and respect. But more importantly, she had seen something else in their faces, a kind of shame that suggested they were reconsidering their own behavior and values. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset over the Pacific. The same view she had enjoyed for months, but now with a different perspective. Her phone buzzed with another interview request. This one from a national magazine wanting to do a feature story on veterans transitioning to civilian life. She declined, just as she had declined most of the media requests that week. She had made her point, and now it was time to return to the quiet life she had originally sought in Millfield. But it would be a different kind of quiet now, not the invisibility of someone dismissed and forgotten, but the peaceful confidence of someone whose worth was finally acknowledged. The doorbell rang, and Sarah opened it to find Dr. Chen standing on her porch, having flown up from San Francisco specifically to meet her in person. "Admiral Mitchell," Dr. Chen said, embracing her warmly. "I wanted to thank you again, and to tell you something I couldn't say during the conference. When you carried me to that helicopter in Somalia, I was conscious enough to hear what you told the pilot. You said, 'This woman is worth more than all of us combined, because she came here to heal children who aren't even her own.'
That's when I knew I was in the hands of someone who understood what real service means. Sarah felt tears in her eyes for the second time since her retirement. But these were different tears than the ones she had shed in the grocery store parking lot.
You didn't need to come all this way, Sarah said. Yes, I did, Doctor, Chen replied. Because you taught me something this week that I needed to remember. Service isn't just about the dramatic moments, the rescues and the operations that make headlines. Service is about how we treat each other every single day, how we recognize the dignity in everyone we meet, how we stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. As they sat together watching the sunset, Sarah realized that her retirement had taught her something she hadn't learned during 30 years of military service. The most important battles aren't always fought with weapons in foreign countries. Sometimes they're fought with words in community centers, with quiet dignity in grocery stores, and with the patient work of helping people remember who they're supposed to be. The woman who had been mocked and targeted by her community was indeed a Navy SEAL Admiral, but more than that, she was a reminder of what Americans could be when they chose service over selfishness, courage over comfort, and genuine community standards over arbitrary exclusion. And in the end, that was a victory worth more than any military decoration.